Good afternoon, everyone. Very glad to welcome you here the day after such a wonderful event in the history of the United States. I'm sure all of you were as enthralled as we were here yesterday, watching the inauguration and just being totally thrilled with what we saw take place in Washington. Unfortunately, it's a day later, and the real world is out there with many, many, many challenges facing our wonderful new young president and his very able team. My name is Ken Yalowitz. I'm the director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding, and I'm delighted to welcome you to another of our Great Issues series of lectures. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the background, these lectures are devoted to the name to honor President John Sloan Dickey of Dartmouth, who was president from 1945 to 1970. And his great interest was in international affairs and making sure that all Dartmouth students had a good understanding of the major international issues of the day, but equally important, a commitment to do something about them. And his words were always to go out into the world and do something about the problems, that there was nothing that better people couldn't do in terms of dealing with problems. And we instituted this series of lectures 5 years ago. And the subject matter varies. We can cover the humanities, we can cover the social sciences, or the sciences. And today we are extremely fortunate to have with us a good friend and a very esteemed colleague from the U.S. State Department, Ambassador Nicholas Burns, who has had a very distinguished career and who's going to talk today about the very difficult, very complex, vexing foreign policy agenda facing President Obama and the United States. And I can tell you there is no one better, no one more qualified to give you that world view. Ambassador Burns, Nick Burns, today has retired, from the State Department, from the Foreign Service, and he is now the professor in the practice of diplomacy and international politics at Harvard's Kennedy School. He served as the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs from 2005 to 2008. And I want to underscore, those of us in the room who are former Foreign Service officers all know that the Undersecretary for Political Affairs is the highest ranking position that a career Foreign Service officer normally can aspire to. So Nick reached the very top of our ladder, and we're all very, very proud of him for doing that. And in that position, he led negotiations on Iran, on India, on Kosovo, and many other important issues, and also oversaw U.S. diplomatic efforts in every region of the world. That's the job of the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. Prior to that, he served with distinction as a U.S. ambassador twice to NATO from 2001 to 2005, and also to Greece from 1997 to 2001. He also served as the State Department spokesman for Secretaries of State Madeleine Albright and Warren Christopher, and Special Assistant to the President for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia Affairs, and a member of the National Security Council staff during the collapse of the Soviet Union during the period 1990 to 1995. And that's really where I got to know Nick very well, because I was stationed at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, and we were on the other end of many, many telephone calls during that very important period. He also served in the American Consulate General in Jerusalem in 1985 through 87, when he coordinated U.S. economic assistance to the Palestinian people in the West Bank, and at the American embassies in Egypt and Mauritania. I also want to pay a special word of welcome to Nick's wife, Libby, who's right here down in the first row. It's a pleasure to have them both here today. And please join me in a very warm welcome for Ambassador Nick Burns.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me in the back. Thanks to Ambassador Ken Yalowitz for that overly generous introduction, but also for his friendship over many years. I've been very pleased to see him here at Dartmouth. We were driving up yesterday from Boston, Libby and I tried to remember the last time I was in Hanover, New Hampshire, and at Dartmouth, and believe it or not, it was 42 years ago. I was 10 years old, and one of my best friends invited me to a Dartmouth Brown football game. In October of 1966. It was a splendid day. It was one of those beautiful autumnal, golden, sparkling New Hampshire days, and something very, very unusual happened. Dartmouth was victorious in the football game. So I remember that day very well. It was a huge gap in my education that I had not come back to Hanover and to Dartmouth since then, so I've been very pleased to be back. We've had a nice day. We sat down with some incredibly smart students at about 12:30 for an hour and just talked about foreign policy, talked about all the issues that Obama will face now that he's president, talked about the importance of public service, and certainly we've got an exemplar of public service in our new president, and I hope he can inspire lots of young Dartmouth students to think about careers in the government and in public service generally. And then we had a chance, Ken and I, to talk to a Russian politics class. They're studying Russia in the 20th century. And since the two of us played minor bit roles, Ken a lot bigger than mine, in those dramatic years, 1989, 90, 91, 92, when the Soviet Union collapsed, when it splintered into 15 pieces, when we tried to react to that, President Bush, 41, and then President Clinton, that was nice to relive those days and to be teaching with Ken. So I'm really pleased to be here. And Ken has asked me, and the Dickey Center has asked me to talk about President Obama's foreign policy challenges. That's a big subject. I'll try to do it as briefly as I can, and I look forward to talking to all of you, hearing your views, answering any questions you have. I also want to recognize another friend in the audience, Jim Shea, who is a newcomer, not to New England because he's a native New Englander, but to Dartmouth, has just joined the development office in November, an old friend from graduate school, so I'm very pleased to be with him as well. A word on the inauguration. I know everybody saw it. We were in Boston watching it with Libby's parents, and I must say, what a luminous, inspiring day it was. I think for every American, and I hope if you're not from America, you're an international student here, I hope you feel the same way that the Americans did. I was inspired by yesterday. I thought it was a consequential inauguration because it comes at a consequential time for the United States. Because we're at such a crossroads, not just from a domestic point of view as to how we restructure health care, how we climb out of the economic recession, but also how we respond to the rest of the world. And so you look back at our history, over 233 years, I think there have been few inaugurations, maybe some, Lincoln's first and second, Roosevelt's, FDR's inauguration, his first in March of 1933, but maybe just a few that were as consequential in terms of where we're going as a country as yesterday's inauguration. And then add to that the unique, special nature of the fact that he's our first African-American president, and that his election and inauguration represents something extraordinary about our country, that we're finally beginning to deal effectively with the question of race and to overcome 233 years, really almost 400 years of racism. And what he represents is so hopeful, I think, and inspiring for our country, what his family represents for our country as well. And the last thing I thought about just today, thinking about what I saw yesterday in the inauguration, was how he filled the stage. And it was a huge stage. If you look at the New York Times this morning, or if you watched CNN yesterday, the camera vantage point from the Capitol, sweeping down the mall, past the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, maybe the largest crowd in the history of the city of Washington. I think it was somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people. and an enormous stage physically, but also an enormous stage psychically as to what was happening and about the problems ahead, I thought he filled the stage. He was graceful and composed and sophisticated in what he said, and I was just tremendously inspired by it. That's just one citizen's view of the inauguration, but I thought I want to share that with you. Now, what happened this morning? I saw a photograph on the internet just before I came over of Obama entering the Oval Office from the walkway that comes through the Rose Garden. That's what connects his house to his office. And so I thought that one way to start this talk today and our discussion today would be to say, what do you think happened when he sat down at that desk and had his first meeting, which was on the global economic crisis, and then his second meeting, which was on the foreign policy challenges? I don't know if the White House has briefed on what happened, but I was trying to imagine from my own experience. Ken and I served in government for 28 years until I retired, and so we've been in that situation where, you're asked to brief the president. So the question I'd like to ask all of you is, what do you think you would have said this morning to the president if you were seated at the cabinet table or in the Roosevelt room, one of the two, and he walked in and said, okay, you heard my inaugural speech. You heard what a daunting agenda we have. What should we do on the issue of America's relations to the rest of the world? So I'm going to give you a little bit of time to think about that, and I'm going to fill the space by telling you what I would have said had I been here. But I'll challenge you to let me know what you think when it comes time to questions and answers. Here's what I would have said to the president this morning. I would have said the proverbial, Mr. President, there's good news and there's bad news about the position of the United States as the leading global power in the world today. And I'm going to start with the good news because, it's your first day in office. And you had a long day. I think you went to 10 inaugural balls last night. You must be exhausted. And here's the good news about the United States. We will continue to be, at least for the next 50 years, I am sure, the most powerful country in the world. I say, Mr. President, I don't agree with all the people, Paul Kennedy, in an op-ed from Yale University last week, he's back, saying America is falling from world power. America will no longer be the dominant world power. I'd say, Mr. President, I disagree with that. And let me tell you why. Think of the metrics of power. How do we measure power in the world? Militarily. Militarily, we are by a long mile the world's strongest country in our capacity to project force, to organize it, to sustain people in uniform around the world. And that's not going to diminish because we've had a bad experience in Iraq, or because we have perhaps an even tougher one to come in Afghanistan, or because we've had the legs knocked out from under our economy. That's not going to diminish. We have a capacity that no other country does. We continue to spend on our national defense a sum of money that is greater than the total of the next 15 countries combined. No one else has the supercarrier battle groups that we have to deploy on the high seas around the world. No one else has 9,000 Abrams tanks. No one else has the capacity that we do to defend our country, but also to defend our allies and to project force. So militarily, which is a consequential and important metric of power, we will remain supreme. Politically, that's another metric of power. Our ability to be influential. Madeleine Albright said when she was Secretary of State, we're the indispensable power. A lot of the Europeans were upset. They said, that sounds arrogant. I don't think she meant it to be arrogant. She's not an arrogant person. She meant it to be factual. Whether countries like us or not, when there is trouble, they call us. And so I know what will happen, and I hope will happen in Gaza and in Israel, is that when they come to speak about peace, the key intermediary will be the United States, despite the disaffection of some Palestinians, many for the United States. When India and Pakistan argue over their own problems, the first country they now call is not their former colonial power, Great Britain, it's the United States. Who was the first foreign leader to go to Islamabad and Delhi after the Mumbai attacks in December? It was Condoleezza Rice, our Secretary of State. When China and Taiwan have had problems over the Taiwan Straits, and China's a world power, they asked the United States to intervene in that crisis. And so our political reach, which is a very important metric of power, remains very strong. And third, there's the concept of our soft power, which a colleague of mine at the Kennedy School, Joe Nye, Professor Joe Nye, has talked about and written about. It's all the power that's outside our government but in our society. It's everything from the attractiveness of our values, which is real, to the fact that our corporations have an enormously positive role to play in the world. If you think about the reach of Microsoft on every computer screen in the world, the reach of McDonald's, the reach of Starbucks. And if you think about the fact that we are a magnet, and Dartmouth College is a magnet, for students from all around the world. Higher education, as Fareed Zakaria said in his recent book, may be our best brand. And so, despite the fact that there are a lot of people in the world who say they are anti-American, who may not agree with the policies of the United States government, we still wield soft power because of who we are as a country, because of our history, because of our society. And that is a dimension of power in the age of globalization which one should not discount. It is concrete. And it's part of how countries need to compete in the world today. So I'd say, Mr. President, from those three perspectives, military, political, and soft power, the United States and the country you're now heading, the military you're leading as commander-in-chief, the government you're leading as our president, we are a powerful country and will remain so for the future. Now here's the bad news. And he knew the bad news was coming. And it comes in several different bits. And the first is obvious. And he knows this, because he talked about it yesterday. It was the whole centerpiece of his speech. We're in tough times economically. We're in more than tough times economically. We're in a crisis situation where the certainties we felt about how we should structure ourselves economically, about the rules of the game, about what citizens do versus corporate chieftains, all those rules they've been knocked aside and put into question. And there's a basic psychological question I think most Americans felt until mid-September of 2008, pretty much confident that we had the right balance of power between those who run the private economy and those in government who regulate it. And now that's all been knocked asunder, because we see that the excesses on Wall Street, the greed on Wall Street, and as Obama said, I think to his credit yesterday, that not just on Wall Street, but collectively 300 million of us have not made the tough decisions about how much we spend and how much we take in taxes. And so, obviously, one would say to the President of the United States this morning, the biggest part of your job will be how to recover from this catastrophic setback that we've suffered here at home, how to organize the world to do that as well. I say, Mr. President, that's the first bit of bad news, but there's more. I'd also say that, from a foreign policy perspective, I can't remember a time like this when we've faced so many crises nearly simultaneously. I mean, think about what we are up against right now. There are people in this audience who will remember the Second World War. Now, that was a supreme test on two fronts. We're not facing something perhaps as ominous as that, but in fighting two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, one that has not gone well until recently, Iraq, with no clear exit strategy in sight yet, and one Afghanistan where the new president says he's going to build up the troops by 20,000. It's unusual in our history to fight two wars simultaneously in two different parts of the world against a shadowy adversary, terrorist groups in both places. So that's unusual. What's the rest of this daunting foreign policy agenda? We have two countries in the world, Iran and North Korea, that are seeking a nuclear weapons capability, and if either attains it, it will change the balance of power against the United States and all of our allies in North Asia, in the case of North Korea, and in the Middle East in the case of Iran. We also have the problem of terrorism. We can't forget that despite the fact, as President Bush reminded us as he left office, we haven't been attacked here at home since 9/11. The fight, the struggle against terrorism, against al-Qaeda, and the other groups that would seek to destroy us, or at least to kill a lot of us, that fight continues. I was impressed by Obama's remark yesterday when he said, "We will defeat you." Those were aggressive words. He met that challenge squarely yesterday. It's as big a challenge globally as the wars that we're fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, and certainly as big as the Iran and North Korea problems. But that's not all that's on the agenda. There's climate change. We've ignored that problem. We haven't really decided how we're going to reduce carbon emissions here at home. We have not joined Kyoto. We've not been part of the international effort to deal with it, and yet we're the largest carbon emitter in the world. There are food shortages looming. Bob Zoellick, the president of the World Bank, is worried He said a couple of months ago that we might face food shortages in the world in 2009 and 10. There's the possibility of pandemics. Not just the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which is serious enough, but others, if we're not careful and if we don't prepare to combat them. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. You know, if we wanted to have a whole session on the number of foreign policy crises that we're facing, it would be a long session indeed. So I'd say, Mr. President, in addition to the economic crisis, you've got a foreign policy agenda that will not quit. And I can't remember a time when any American president has taken office with such an agenda before him, perhaps at least since FDR's third inaugural in 1940 on the eve of our entry into the Second World War. There's more bad news. There's more bad news. As some people predict that we're going to lose world power, other countries are rising to power in the world. India is rising in South Asia, and China in the Far East, and certainly Russia's back as a big problem for the United States. Brazil is rising in our hemisphere, as is Mexico, Nigeria, and South Africa. In Africa, Indonesia as well as the largest Muslim country in the world. So for the first time in our memory, well, most of our memories, I'd say since the close of the Second World War, the United States is no longer the supreme power alone. And the unipolar moment that we had, that Charles Krauthammer, the Washington Post columnist, talked about, say the time between the collapse of the Soviet Union and 9/11, when we were really alone in our power. We could pretty much do what we wanted. That's over. American power is now being checked by the rise of these other countries who are consequential. All you have to do is look at who our largest creditor is in the world, China, to know that we can no longer do whatever we want in the world without listening to other countries. I'd say, Mr. President, there's one additional piece of bad news. I think it's bad news because it's the remaining unsettled and unresolved question from America's 233-year history about who we are as a people as we relate to others around the world. And here's the question. Are we going to put aside our historic tendency to retreat and to be isolationist when times are tough? Or are we going to also turn aside this illusion of unilateralism that the neoconservatives put forth in the last decade? And are we going to embrace effective engagement with the rest of the world as a leading world power? I still think, unfortunately, that question is unresolved in our history. And it runs throughout our entire history. And what I'd say, respectfully, to someone who's a lot smarter than I am, Barack Obama, would be to say, you've also got to grapple with that question as you lead us forward, because it's going to be a natural tendency for the American people at a time like this to want to turn inward, with so many Americans out of work and the unemployment rolls rising, with so many people having lost their homes because their mortgages have been foreclosed, and with so many people really worried about their 401ks and what they're going to do for retirement. And so at a time like this, it's natural that people would say, you know, why should we spend $500 billion a year on our national defense, on the military? Why should we have doubled foreign assistance over the last 8 years, as President Bush did? Why should we spend $30 billion on HIV/AIDS programs around the world? I'm for all that. I'm for all that. But I think a lot of people will now question it because times are so tough here. And what the President is going to need to do is to say to the American people, if we don't lead, and if we retreat and pull the covers over our heads on stormy mornings because we feel more secure, then we're certainly going to fail. We're certainly going to fail. And just, you know, this argument goes all the way through our history. Jefferson and Madison had this debate about whether or not we should be engaged in the world, or in Jefferson's terms, you know, try to perfect this pure agrarian democracy in the United States. John Quincy Adams, a great New Englander, famously said America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. When Teddy Roosevelt came along and said, let's build an empire on the eve of the Spanish-American War, President Eliot of Harvard said, that's not who we are. We're not an empire. We don't go abroad to colonize people. And some of you will remember that great national popular icon of the 1930s, Charles A. Lindbergh. Now, he was kind of a combination of, you know, who's the most popular American today? Besides Barack Obama, who I think is the most popular American. But in our popular culture, Tiger Woods is popular. Oprah's popular. Think of people that are universally admired. Charles A. Lindbergh was. What did he say in 1937 and 38 and 39 and 40? He was in the Boston Garden and Madison Square Garden saying, that's not our fight in Europe against Hitler and Mussolini. And he was wrong. He led the isolationists against FDR, and fortunately FDR triumphed. So this argument goes all the way through our history. When I was State Department spokesman, Madeleine Albright objected to the fact that the Senate had cut our UN dues in half. And she had a very respectful debate with Senator Jesse Helms about this. She said, how can we be the host country leading donor and the member of the Security Council and not pay our UN dues? So I think this argument, which runs all throughout our history, is still with us. And I'd say to President Obama, we need to settle that. In the age of globalization, if we don't engage, we fail in the world. We can't succeed in the world. And I'd say, Mr. President, that's the bad news. Now, he would likely say to someone like me, if you think you're so smart, you've just diagnosed what's wrong with the United States, what should we do? And I'd like to suggest, as you think about what you'd say, because you're not off the hook on that, I'd say to the President, well, look, there are 4 or 5 things that one could think of doing, big things, big strategic issues to engage on, that if you could make progress on them, would give us a better possibility of resolving these problems. And here they are, in a very brief telegraphic form. First, it's all about the economy. Remember Bill Clinton's 1992 campaign? Well, we're back to the economy, but back in spades. If we don't succeed in rebuilding the economic foundations of the country, we can't be successful on anything else. And so I would imagine the President will have to spend the great majority of his time on this issue. And it comes in two batches here, this economic question. The first is, what do we do here at home? What should the level of our taxation be? How much debt should we acquire? How big will be the hole as we blast through the budget ceiling and perhaps entertain a budget deficit of greater than $1 trillion at the present rate of spending, historic by American standards? What should we do here at home to get out of the economy? And then the second question is, how do we organize ourselves internationally, because it's a global economic crisis. And we can't get out of it ourselves. A lot depends on the second most powerful country in the world, our creditor, the country that holds more of our value than anybody else, China. Will we work effectively with China and India and Brazil and Russia and the European Union and Japan? I thought it was very important that when President Bush called the first international meeting after our election to deal with the economic crisis, it wasn't the old group from the old world of the 20th century, the G7. The G7 is Canada, the United States, Japan, and 4 European countries, and we've added Russia. Okay? What did President Bush do? When the Europeans said the G7 should meet, President Bush, to his credit, said, no, the G20 should meet. How can we have a meeting to resolve the economic crisis if China's not at the table, if India is not at the table, if President Lula of Brazil is not at the table? And he was right. And so the second question here will be, can Obama work effectively internationally to rewrite the rules of the international game so that we don't have to suffer a recurrence of this massive problem that we had with the financial markets shaking, with confidence in Wall Street absolutely obliterated on the part of average consumers like all of us? How do we recreate economic stability and success? That's the ball game. That's it. I say, Mr. President, that's what you need to focus on. But what else is there beyond the economic crisis? Well, there's the Middle East and South Asia. And I'd say to the President, as you look out at your foreign policy challenges, a traditional old world 20th century 1998 way of looking at the world would be Europe's the most important part of the world. We're active around the world, we're a global power, we're everywhere around the world, we have interests universally, but Europe's the most important. For all of our history, from the times when the Pilgrims landed in 1620 until about 10 or 15 years ago, any professor giving a lecture about America's national interests will say, well, Europe of all the regions is the most important. And certainly for the 20th century, that's where we were engaged principally. First World War, 2 million American troops in Western Europe. Second World War, we mobilized 12 million American troops in 2 theaters. Cold War, for 50 years, we stationed 300,000 troops in Europe. We fought 2 hot wars and a Cold War in Europe in the 20th century, but we succeeded. Basically, Europe is now united, more or less, democratic, more or less, stable, more or less, and the communist threat and the nuclear threat have largely disappeared. We've had an enormous national and international success, and people in this room, and there are many of you, who served in government or who paid taxes or who had sons or brothers who served in the military, or perhaps you did, you're all part of that success. So I'd say to the President, it's still important, Europe, but that primary, vital national focus has shifted to the Middle East and South Asia. If the fires were burning in Europe in the 20th century, they're now burning in the Middle East and South Asia in the 21st. And so while we need to be engaged everywhere as a superpower, we must focus principally on these two parts of the world. Isn't it obvious? If you think about what we're up against in the Middle East, the Iraq War, we still have 150,000 American troops there. How to get them home safely, but also to help the Iraqis to stabilize their country and not return to the kind of violence we saw just in 2007 and 2006 before the surge. How to deal with the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. We're nearly 61 years into it. Since May 14, 1948, when Israel was created, the Israelis haven't had a single day of peace since then, and 61 years since the Palestinians were dispersed, and they haven't had a single day of justice since then. I hope our new president will put us right into the middle of the diplomatic effort to resolve that. We can't afford to take a day off or a week off or several years off, as we did, unfortunately, over the last 8. We need to do what Condoleezza Rice did over the last year. I think she made 12 trips since she launched the Annapolis process, but she launched it. We launched it. I was with her in November, October, November of 2007. I hope that Obama, if he's in for 2 terms, will spend both terms trying to bring peace to the Middle East. Think of Iran. Iran's a country that is very powerful, has a big view of itself, is trying to achieve a nuclear weapons capability, and that's not in our interest. It's also the largest funder and supporter of all the terrorist groups that afflict us in the Middle East. Think of the problems we have in the Middle East. How about South Asia? South Asia might be more difficult and more forbidding and more dangerous. Of the 192 members of the United Nations system, if I had to pick one to worry about, principally, it would be Pakistan. Pakistan's a friend. It's a Muslim country, so we need to have a good relationship with it, a large country. But it also has nuclear weapons. It's also highly unstable. It also has in its territory Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And both of them are crossing the border from Pakistan in safe havens to Afghanistan, firing at our soldiers, presenting an enormous security threat, and then retreating back across the border. This is a mix, a combustible mix of challenges that I think is the most dangerous for the United States and the world today. And also in South Asia, we have Afghanistan. I think Barack Obama correctly said, rightly said during the campaign, that's the center of the war against Al-Qaeda. That's where we have to be to defend ourselves, and now he'll put in 20,000 more troops. But how to win against a terrorist group, and what constitutes victory, and how to put together an effective counterinsurgency strategy, the mix of military action with economic assistance to win hearts and minds, not just battles. And so I think in those 2 areas, I'd say to the President, if Europe was FDR to George Bush's primary focus, yours has to be South Asia and the Middle East. So he needs to attack the economy. He needs to focus on the Middle East and South Asia. What else should President Obama do? I'd say he should follow his instincts on how to deal with those rising powers that we talked about. He's got great instincts, I think, from his campaign, just listening to him. A static zero-sum approach, kind of an old think approach to this question of how to deal with China, India, Brazil, Russia, would be, gosh, if they're going to gain on us, we must be losing. If they get richer, we must be poorer. If they get stronger militarily, we're going to be weaker. I think that's an older, not very sophisticated way of looking at these countries. What I hear Obama saying is, actually, in a highly integrated, globalized 21st century world where a cough on Wall Street becomes a flu in Shanghai, and that's what happened in the financial crisis, where everything affects everything else, isn't it in our interest to have strong countries in the world that can help us to get out of the mess we're in? I look at it this way, and we had this conversation, Ken and I, with some students, Dartmouth students today, and some of them are here. We went around the room after lunch and said, okay, let's try to think of what really worries us in the world. You know, what are the big problems out there? And so here's what the Dartmouth group came up with. Climate change, terrorism, international drug cartels, crime cartels, trafficking of women and children cartels, energy, pandemics, piracy. We had 10.
The global issues, drugs.
Right. We reached 10. And then we asked ourselves the question, so what's the common denominator among those 10? And here it is. The United States cannot succeed in a single one of them if we act alone in the world. Or if we try to be unilateralist, or if we try to hide through isolationism. The only way to cure climate change is to work with China and India, and Japan and the Europeans. The only way to defeat terrorism is to work with Russia and China and India, and so on. And so I think Obama's instincts are to say, actually the glass is half full. It's not half empty. If China and India are richer, actually they'll have more wherewithal to work with us on these substantial problems ahead. And so I think his instincts, which are very different from most of the American political elite on this, are good, and he should follow them, and I'd encourage him to do that. I'd have 2 last bits of advice on what he should do. He doesn't need this advice. He's a smart guy, but we have to fill this hour. And you have to tell me what you think. I'd say, and this is the 4th I think I've given him, rebuild the international system and believe in it. And don't think that America can act alone in the world. It's kind of it's a connection to the earlier points. But here's what I mean by it. Most people around the world have faith in the United Nations. Most people don't drive around the world with bumper stickers saying, get US out of the UN. You don't see many of them in Hanover. You don't see many in Cambridge, Mass, or in Washington, D.C., but you see a lot in the United States still, and it bothers me. What do we have against the United Nations? Well, let's think about that for a moment. It was Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt's idea. It was an American idea. It's in our biggest city. We're the largest donor, that's for sure, but we probably get the most out of it. Susan Rice, when she testified last week to become our UN ambassador, and she's an exceptionally fine and bright person, she said, this is the best deal we have. Because if we didn't have the United Nations to reach out to people who are poor around the world, to reach out to people who are afflicted by disease, to run all the peacekeeping missions in places that we don't want to go, then we'd have to do it ourselves. And we have to pay more and have to have more troops to do the job of being the world's policeman. It's not us. The world's policeman is the UN. But we've given so many signals in the past decade or so that we don't believe in it. One of my colleagues in government was a guy named John Bolton, and he used to brag about the fact that he wanted to take 10 stories off the UN building. And he wanted to limit the power of the UN. I say, follow Obama's internationalist instincts. Build it up. Help it. It's not the answer to all the problems of the world. The UN has a lot of weaknesses, but it's the answer to some of them. Think about the organization that really runs the UN, the Security Council. It's really a symbol of part of the problem of old think versus new think. Who sits in the Security Council as permanent members? The 5 victorious powers of the Second World War. So they're the countries that in September of 1945 were supremely powerful. Last time I checked, we were in January of 2009. You know, more than 60 years later, well over 60 years later. And so how can we have a Security Council and Japan's not on it? Japan's the 2nd largest contributor to the United Nations system. China's not on it. India's not on it. Brazil's not on it. And by the way, not a single African country's not on it. And there are 53 African countries. So if I were an African looking at the UN, I'd say, why should I pay dues to this organization? I have no say. And if I were China, I'd probably say the same thing. And so I hope that our new president and our new Congress will say, let's lead and let's rebuild those international institutions, because part of the answer to our problems is not just relying on ourselves, but relying on the UN and the regional institutions, ASEAN in Southeast Asia, the African Union in Africa, the Organization of American States in Latin America, NATO, where I was ambassador, where Libby and I lived, and the European Union in Europe. Part of the answer to the global problems is to empower those organizations and let them do some of the work for the global good. Here's the last thing I'd say, and this is an easy one. because it comes right from the Obama campaign trail and from the slogans and from yesterday's event. Hope, not fear. And he doesn't need to hear this. But if he asked, I'd say, Mr. President, you are absolutely right. It's all about hope, not fear. For somehow, we took this great crisis following 9/11 and we kind of went into a defensive crouch. And it was good guys versus bad guys. Remember the rhetoric? And you're with us or against us. And all of this. And what a lot of people around the world heard was, we're being excluded, not included. And what I hear Obama saying yesterday and throughout the last 2 years is, we can become again the country that unites in a positive way the peoples of the world. Not everyone's always going to agree with us, but they're going to look to us for leadership. And think about our greatest presidents. Think about Woodrow Wilson at Versailles saying, end to empire. FDR with the four freedoms. Ronald Reagan saying, bring down communism and free people. And now Barack Obama, who seems to be saying, we have a tremendous amount of work to do all around the world, and we Americans will roll up our sleeves and we'll pitch in and we'll play our share and we will lead positively. And if he can do that, I think he has a very good chance not just to be a successful president, but a transformational president. And we should all, whether we're Democrats, Republicans, independents, agnostic, whatever, we should want him to be that president, given the fix that we are in and the number of problems ahead of us. That's what I'd say to the president. It's a big agenda. I don't know why anyone wants this job. But he has it, and we should support him. Thank you for listening to me. Let me know what's on your mind. And I want to hear your views as well. Thank you.
Priority to Dartmouth students, so please raise your hand, and we have a microphone. So students first, and then everyone else.
Thank you very much, Mr. Burns. It was a fantastic, fantastic talk. I wanted to, ask you a little bit about looking at reassessing America's foreign aid budget, and really with focus on failed states and seeing poverty as a key incubator of major problems. And so I was curious to ask you about what you would envision for an Obama agenda in reassessing America's aid budget, say towards Israel, Egypt, and the Middle East in particular.
I think that's a great question. Thank you for answering it. I don't have magical answers, and you probably can answer this as well as I could, but here, I'll take a shot at it. I think you're right to ask the question because... Repeat the question, please. Yes, I'd be very happy to. The question was, Dartmouth student, what's your name?
Bill.
Bill.
Bill Lundin.
Bill. Bill said that, part of what we want to know, how do we deal with failed states? How do we deal with states that can't take care of their own populations? And what do we do with the problem of world poverty? And I think he's right to ask the question because, and Obama said this in his speech yesterday. I was impressed by it. He said we need to pay attention to those people around the world who, we are relatively prosperous, he said, and we need to spend more time thinking about those who are not. And that's in the American tradition. We haven't always met that bar, but it's in the American tradition to ask that question. There are 750 million people in India alone living on less than $2 a day. It's the greatest collection of poor people in the world. And while we have doubled our aid budget over the last 8 years, and I think President Bush did that to his credit, if you look at our aid as a percentage of our gross domestic product, we rank about 30th in the world. Nearly all the European countries, on a relative basis, not absolute, contribute more to international aid efforts than we. So I hope that despite the fact we have problems here at home and there are Americans who are hurting who need help, I think we're right to think about what more we can do, expand the aid budget. I think we need to rebuild AID. The Agency for International Development is the principal agency that extends aid around the world. At the height of the Vietnam War, we had about 13,000 aid officers. We're now down to about 2,000. It gets to a larger point. The balance between the military and diplomacy. I feel that we are presently unbalanced, or at least have been unbalanced, as a former diplomat. I think we've somehow put too much on the shoulders of the military, and that we haven't led with diplomacy. We've sometimes led with the punch before we talk. I think it should be the other way around. We have 6,500 diplomats. We have more musicians in the armed forces bands of the Navy, Army, Air Force, Marines than we do diplomats. We are woefully understaffed, and I was delighted to hear President Obama say last week, I want to rebuild the diplomatic corps, add people to it. I hope he does that for AID as well. Could I say one more thing? There was a student named Samuel Christ, who I don't think is here today now, but he was in the class, that the group of students with whom Ken and I met before. I found out after the class that he had served in Iraq. And I think it's an incredibly great thing that we have young people like him who are willing to serve in the military. And so when I say let's rebalance the military and diplomacy, we need to have a strong military, and we need young Americans like him to join it. And we honor his service in Iraq. But we also need to give them a break. The military can't be all things to all people. And we need to lead with the civilian side of the government and to use the soft or smart power that all great powers must deploy. So I think that's a big part of the aid problem.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Matt. Kind of going off that question, if you had $100 and you had to split it between the Millennium Development Goals and the military, how would you break it up?
Well, that's a tough question. The Millennium Development Goals, for those of you who are not aid experts, these are the United Nations sponsored goals agreed upon in 2005 as to what the priorities should be in the world, as to how we spend aid dollars. You know, it's a tough one in the age of terrorism. I think that we need to maintain a very strong military, as well as a strong intelligence apparatus. And if you think about America's power, it rests on three foundations: military, intelligence, and diplomacy. I wouldn't necessarily try to rob the military and intelligence agencies of their power or of their budgets. I would just want to increase what we spend on diplomacy and achieve a better balance between them. We shouldn't shortchange the military because Al-Qaeda is still out there. And there may be future Al-Qaedas that come forth. And you know, the problem in the 21st century is that we have a lot of failed states, and terrorism emanates from them, like Somalia and piracy. We have a lot of groups that operate that are not states at all, and they're hard to fight, like Al-Qaeda. When Al-Qaeda attacked us in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi, our embassies, in August of 1998, and then attacked the USS Cole, and then attacked us on 9/11, Tom Friedman wrote, it's one of the first times in recorded history that a small group of people, 15, 20 people, did so much damage. And how do you respond to them? So I think the task of being effective on counterterrorism falls to the military and intelligence principally, and we shouldn't weaken it. But we should have a better balance on the diplomatic side. I hope I've tried to answer your question. I hope I did. Okay?
Over here.
Hi, you mentioned in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and you mentioned that Israelis haven't had peace and Palestinians haven't had justice. Do you think that there is a solution? If so, what does it look like, and how do we get there?
You know, I've never... All in 30 seconds. I've never believed that the problem is unresolvable. I just don't believe that. I don't even believe it's the hardest problem in the world. But it's a daunting one, and I guess I'd say this. The Palestinians deserve justice. They deserve a state. They're a consequential people in terms of their numbers and the role they've played in the Middle East. What Libby and I discovered when we lived in East Jerusalem, which is the Palestinian side of Jerusalem, in the mid-'80s, and I worked in the West Bank. They're lovely people, family-oriented, prize education, and they want peace. Now, there's certain among them, the Hamas leaders, who are despicable, who are terrorists, but the vast majority of Palestinians just want an ordinary life. The Israelis are great people who deserve peace and deserve security. What Israel is facing is what, again, Tom Friedman and a lot of other Middle East experts have talked about. If they continue to occupy the West Bank and not resolve the Gaza problem, they will either cease being democratic or cease being a Jewish state. No one wants that. Everyone should want to preserve a Jewish democratic state, Israel in the Middle East. But that means giving up the occupation. Israel should not do that easily. They shouldn't do it freely. And they have to do it only with security promises from the Palestinians. I can see no alternative to a major American mediating effort. And frankly, despite the horrific events in Gaza over the last month, if you look at Israeli politics and what almost everyone is saying but Mr. Netanyahu, they seem to recognize that a two-state solution is now a necessity. And if you look at the Palestinian majority leadership in Ramallah of Abu Mazen, the Fatah faction of Palestine, they want a two-state solution. They're willing to live with Israel in peace. So the ingredients are there. There needs to be a midwife. We need to be that midwife. Easier said than done. But I think it can be resolved with time, effort, and commitment on the part of our country, and more importantly, the part of the Israelis and Palestinians. Thank you.
Given the recent economic problems, how important and how difficult will it be to resist protectionism in terms of trade?
A great question. Everyone hear it. How do we resist protectionism? Some of the people in this audience will remember the protectionism of the 1930s that deepened the Depression at the end of the Hoover administration into the Roosevelt administration. I think it's a key issue, and frankly, I mean, I'll just show all my cards here. I'm a private citizen, so I can do that now. I voted for Obama, and I supported Obama, and I was overjoyed, as was my wife, to see him win. But what worried me about the Democrats in the primaries and the general election was the questioning of free trade. I was amazed when Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama questioned NAFTA and said they wanted to renegotiate NAFTA. I just believe, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I believe that free trade is the basis of international growth, and that NAFTA has been a huge success for Mexico, for Canada, and the United States. The Colombia Free Trade Agreement, you know, Colombia is probably our most loyal friend in the Americas. And we would have a free trade agreement that would benefit U.S. business, and the Democrats would not allow that to be ratified by the Senate. So I think if the Republican challenge is to commit themselves to international engagement, given the neoconservatism and unilateralism in part of that party, the Democratic challenge, I think, in the Democratic Party is to commit themselves to not repeat the mistakes of the 1930s by raising the barriers to trade, which will shut down growth around the world. So that would be my hope, that the Democrats could achieve a more liberal commitment to free trade, not a closed one.
And that's a refrain of John Sloan Dickey.
Is that right?
Very
Yeah.
much. Very much. Right behind him.
Hi, Mr. Ambassador. I'm just interested to know, how is Obama going to approach the issues in the Balkans? I'm sure you're an expert in the Balkans. You've been there many times recently. Yeah, I'm just interested to know if there is going to be any shift in the foreign policy, considering that there has been a consistent policy from Clinton to George W. Bush.
Thank you very much. Where are you from?
Kosovo.
You're from Kosovo?
Yeah.
Congratulations. One of the most optimistic days in my government service was February 18th, 2008, when Kosovo became independent. So congratulations, because you deserved it.
Thank you.
And I think your country can be a democracy in a region that needs it. I anticipate the Democrats to have, the Obama administration, to have a very enlightened policy. If you look back at what Bill Clinton did, he had huge successes. We fought 2 wars in the 90s, in Bosnia and Kosovo. We lost very few American soldiers. Our soldiers and the Europeans have kept the peace now for well over a decade in Bosnia and for exactly a decade in Kosovo. We've now seen your country become independent. We've seen Croatia join NATO. We've seen Slovenia join NATO. And I think we have to hope that Serbia, which, as you well know better than me, is the keystone country in terms of its size and impact, that Serbia can become democratic, and Serbia can look towards the EU and NATO for its future, not towards the kind of unfortunate policies that they've had in the past decade. So I hope and expect the Obama administration would be very much committed to continue the work to build peace and to keep the United States involved, along with the European Union countries, as a force for good. We still have American troops in Kosovo, and they should stay there until we're sure that Serbia no longer presents a threat to your country. That would be my advice if they ask for it, and they haven't asked, by the way.
Yeah, I guess the flip side of the aid coin. I know that a lot of the military assistance negotiations that you were a part of in the last 8 years are actually going to extend through the next decade, and they don't expire until 2015 or later than that.
Right.
So I'm wondering, in your view, what can the Obama administration do in terms of military assistance to the Gulf Cooperation Council, Egypt, and Israel? And how does that relate to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process?
Thank you very much. It's a great question. You know, most of, it gets back to the foreign aid question that Bill asked about. Most of, I think, a very large share of America's foreign aid still was produced by the Camp David Accords in the late 1970, Egypt and Israel being the primary major recipients of U.S. aid because of those commitments that Jimmy Carter made. And as you rightly say, President George Bush made a commitment to Israel. I negotiated the agreement, a 10-year military assistance agreement with Israel. I think that was the right step. What we need to do now, and President Bush was headed in this direction, and I hope that President Obama will pick up the baton, is to say to the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, and to say to Egypt and Jordan, there's a big problem strategic in the Middle East. It's the threat of Iran. And so I do think that the United States should be giving substantial military assistance to the Arab countries as well as to Israel so that that might be a deterrent to Iran. Iran might then become convinced that it should not seek to become the dominant military power in the Middle East. I fear it wishes to be so. And given the fact that Iran is funding Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Shia militants in Iraq, and the Taliban in Afghanistan, that's quite a feat. Iran represents a real threat to the U.S., to Israel, and to the moderate Arab countries. So the strategy of conventional assistance, I think, is a very good one to them. And I would hope that Obama would continue it.
I was hoping you could comment briefly on the steps that the new Pakistani government has taken to combat the Pakistani Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and what further steps they could take without maybe destabilizing the political situation in Pakistan.
Right. I think it's a great question. You know, I have a lot of sympathy for President Zardari, the husband of Benazir Bhutto, because he obviously has good intentions. He went to Kabul and tried to help President Karzai and tried to help repair this rift between Afghanistan and Pakistan that was in place when President Musharraf was president of Pakistan. He has said that he wants to combat Al-Qaeda and the Taliban on Pakistani soil. And in the wake of the Mumbai attacks, he's tried to avoid a conflict with India. I mean, President Zardari has extraordinary problems to deal with. And he exists as a civilian leader, and he doesn't obviously have total control of power in his country because the military is so strong. So I think we have to be a little bit understanding that he operates in an environment which is extraordinarily difficult for him. Having said that, it's in the American interest, with 33,000 American troops in Afghanistan, that Pakistan do a much better job of trying to operate against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in those safe havens along the Pakistan-Afghan border. And it's certainly in the American interest to see Pakistan stop the Kashmiri separatist groups that have been attacking India. You know, Mumbai was a horrific attack. It wasn't the first one. I made 8 trips to India in the last few years. And I remember a series of terrorist attacks in Delhi, in Bangalore, and other Indian cities. And the suspicion is that the Kashmiri groups, the separatist groups in Kashmir, were involved in many of them. And so Pakistan has enormous problems, but it also has enormous responsibilities. And I will be a good friend to Pakistan, and we must be a good friend to Pakistan, but sometimes good friends need to speak frankly and clearly. And I think the message that Obama's been giving them has been very clear. And I'd expect that to continue, and I wish them luck.
So you mentioned earlier how Iran is financing all of these terrorist groups in the Middle East, and we haven't gone to the negotiating table with Iran in many years. How do you think that we can begin to extend a hand and try and negotiate with them without resorting to military means?
That's a great question. You remember Obama's phrase yesterday when he said, those who are autocrats are on the wrong side of history, and they have clenched fists. If you would unclench them, then we'll meet you. I'm paraphrasing. He said it much more nicely than that. I think he's right. We've made a mistake with Iran. I'm not naive about the Iranian government. It is a pernicious government. It is one of the most difficult and aggressive governments in the world, and it's standing against all of our interests. But we haven't talked to them in 30 years on a sustained basis. I mean, really talked to them. We've had, Ken, what? Maybe 4 or 5 or 6 times when we've had one meeting or two throughout 30 years. we've never had a sustained dialogue, and President George W. Bush took the position, well, we're not going to talk to you until you suspend your nuclear program. And frankly, I would say very respectfully and with the benefit of hindsight, I don't think that was correct. I think Obama's correct. And I was, during the campaign, I must say, when Sarah Palin came out and called Obama naive, which I thought was a stretch, for given her prodigious foreign policy credentials, she said Obama's naive because he wants to talk to difficult governments. And I actually wrote an article for Newsweek the week before the election saying, oh, he's right, Obama's right. We should have the self-confidence to talk to difficult governments. So since when has the United States said we're not going to talk to you because we don't like you? FDR didn't do that. Theodore Roosevelt didn't do that. Eisenhower didn't do that. Kennedy didn't do that. My goodness, we talked to the Soviet leadership all throughout the Cold War. We had diplomatic relations, and they were the principal threat to us. So he's right. We should sit down without conditions. We should talk to them and see if there's a diplomatic way out of this mess. Two things will happen. If we get really lucky, and if Obama's really good at this, which I think he will be, then we may find a peaceful diplomatic resolution of our disputes, our many disputes with Iran. If we don't get lucky and we hit a brick wall, we're in a better position, a stronger position, because then we turn back to China and Russia and the Europeans and say, we tried diplomacy, now you all need to help us with stronger sanctions against the Iranians. So I think Obama wins in either case, and I think his instincts have been absolutely right on this, and I will support, fully support, a resumption of negotiations with Iran. I hope we see it in the next couple of months.
I'm just going to add a word from the field when I was ambassador to Georgia. It was a very interesting Iranian who was the Iranian ambassador to Georgia. And on many occasions, we would be at receptions, etc., and we would walk up to each other. We could sort of say hello, and that was the end of it, because we were forbidden to do anything other than the most insignificant sort of social greeting.
Yeah.
And it was very frustrating. Not that we would have accomplished anything, but you just felt the wish to be able to talk. Just to at least.
Yeah.
We dealt with Soviet diplomats at the height of the Cold War. We were talking to them, and
I was going to say one last point on this. I was the Iran point person for the last 3 years, and I never met an Iranian. We were not allowed to meet Iranians, and we were not allowed to have negotiations. It just seemed a little self-defeating after a while.
This is kind of changing the subject a little bit, but what is the most important thing the Obama administration should do in the next year in terms of climate change and energy issues?
Thank you. Thank you for asking that. I actually think most people, we did so much yesterday to restore our image around the world when Obama stood up and put his hand in the Bible and took the oath of office. I think people around the world looked at that and said, this is an American government and leader that we can work with. But now there's the concrete action that has to follow the symbolism. And I do think that climate change might be the issue that certainly Europeans will look towards, and many others in Asia, for American leadership. There's a Copenhagen process, as you know. And essentially there has to be a successor regime to Kyoto that has to be put together. The United States has been totally absent from the Kyoto debate. That's well known. We're the largest carbon emitter. We've not committed ourselves to carbon reductions and have not gotten involved in the necessary give and take and trading and compromising to get an agreement. So I would hope that he would appoint a senior negotiator, dive into these talks, and see if we can get something done for the planet in 2009 and 2010. It's going to be interesting, because if the United States would just fully commit itself, I think all the dynamics change. People will stop blaming us for the whole problem. I think the attention will turn towards India and China, because India and China are essentially saying, we are poor developing countries, and you cannot arrest our economic development at this stage. You guys have already had your growth spurt, right? We haven't. You are advanced economies. We're not. That's not going to wash. I don't think Barack Obama will be able to come back to the Congress and the American people and say, we have to reduce carbon emissions, which will be extraordinarily painful for our industry. And yet China and India won't, our competitors economically. So it's going to be a dramatic negotiation. It'll mirror the Doha round trade negotiations, which essentially broke down because of differences between India and the United States. But we need to put ourselves in a position to be persuasive and to be in the center of the fight. I believe he will do that. He's given every indication he will do so.
We also have to ratify the law of the sea treaty, which is
Yes, yes.
Any other students? Right here.
Thank you. Earlier on, you said that the focus of United States foreign policy should shift away from Europe, as it was in the past, in the 20th century and before, towards Middle East and South Asia. But I was wondering, what is the role of Europe, the European Union, and so, as an American ally, and probably the second biggest or the biggest democratic bloc in the world, and probably a big ally on climate change and different efforts? Like, what's Europe's role, and how does America?
Thank you very much for that question. How many people are here from Europe? All right, let me just try to redeem myself. I wasn't trying to say that Europe's not important. I actually think this is a great story for Europe. It's one of the great achievements in modern history, the European Union, and peace and democracy in Europe. So it's good news that we no longer look upon Europe as a place of division and war and disunity, which is what it was in the 19th and 20th centuries. So what is the value of U.S.-European relations? Europe is still the largest collection of allies of the United States. Our greatest number of allies are in NATO. Our largest trading partners are even still more in Europe than they are in Asia, if you look at the figures. And I think that U.S. policy towards Europe has changed dramatically. It's no longer about Europe. It's about the rest of the world. Meaning, when Barack Obama goes to Strasbourg, and he will go there in April for the 60th anniversary NATO summit, I will bet that on that piece of paper, which are all the issues he raises with Prime Minister Brown and President Sarkozy and Chancellor Merkel, items 1 through 10 will be issues that have nothing to do with Europe itself, but they'll have everything to do with Darfur and with Iran and with climate change and terrorism. So the US and Europe, as the two most successful, most prosperous, most democratic regions on earth, need to shift our attention away from Europe to the rest of the world and work on the rest of the world together. That, I would submit, that's the real basis of US-European relations, and that's a substantial change. From even the time when Ken and I were together in the early 1990s, working on the problem of the disintegration of the Soviet Union. President George H.W. Bush and President Clinton looked towards Europe first because they had to, because that's where the threats were. Obama is going to have to look towards the Middle East and South Asia and East Asia and Africa with Europe as our partner. This is a good news story for the Europeans. We still love you. We're still attached. We're still attached to our NATO allies, believe me.
Let's see. Yep,
now that Obama has suspended the trials at Guantanamo Bay and presumably will close the base pretty soon, what does this mean for our relationship in this administration in international law or with the International Criminal Court and human rights in general? What does this step mean for our relationship there?
I believe it's a necessary step. And I was so happy to hear him say that he would close Guantanamo, that we would not torture, and that we would abide by the Geneva Conventions. I thought the most profoundly important statement he made yesterday, and he made a lot of them, I think it was a very great speech, was that we reject the trade-off between security and our values. You know, we are, by definition and by size and by history, the most important democratic country in the world. And if we give up our values because of our fears, short-term fears, then we destroy ourselves from within. And I was so happy to hear him say that he wanted to bring us back into conformity with international law. It's absolutely vital. I can tell you, you know, and I served with, you know, I was proud to serve in the U.S. government. I'm not. But when I went around to some capitals after Abu Ghraib and tried to convince some country to improve its human rights position, I can tell you sometimes what people told me. You're telling us how to act? And of course I defended our country and stood up for it, as any of us would in that situation. but we have to admit our failures. And Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo and torture were failures. And Obama, I hope, will correct them. And it was a very powerful statement he made yesterday.
Yes, sir. Over here.
Question for you, Ambassador, about our Iraq policy since 2003. The discourse seems to focus mostly on the anguish, the error. There seems to be a general consensus, I would say, or at least predominant opinion, that it was the wrong course that we chose and we executed it poorly. Now, with that said, I think that much too little, at least comes to my attention, about what were the options, the other options that were present, that were discussed in the face of a Saddam who was building a gigantic treasury from oil corruption. The embargo was crumbling. Our allies were, let's say, disinterested in what we attempted to do. And I would love to know from all of the opponents of the course we chose, and I don't disagree with that point of view, I'd like to know what were the options. Was it inescapable that we do something about Saddam? And if so, what would have been the better path?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a very legitimate question to ask. And, you know, we're nearly 6 years to the anniversary of our entry into Iraq to invade and overthrow the government of Saddam Hussein. So I suppose that at Dartmouth and at Harvard, where I teach, you know, for years to come, we're going to have a lot of debates about whether or not that was the right decision. What was an alternative in 2003? Containment. After the first Gulf War, we had successfully contained Saddam Hussein through the no-flight zones in the north and south. We could have continued to contain and could have continued to insist on intrusive United Nations inspections of whether or not there was WMD in Iraq. That's what the United Nations inspectors were looking for. So that was a course. And I suppose we're going to have to debate whether that was the right use of American power in March of 2003. My own view is that I really honor the service of people who went there and fought. And if there are people here who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, we owe you a lot, and we honor your service. I happen to think the decision was not right for American national interests and has not been worth it. I would also say that I think that having said that, and I don't think this is contradictory, it's just the complexity of it, I think President Bush displayed a lot of courage in 2007 in deciding on the surge. I remember all the voices, including the Baker-Hamilton Commission, saying, get out. There's a way out, and get out, and set a timetable. And he said, no, I'm going to put more troops in. And we had a brilliant general, General David Petraeus, who executed that policy, designed it and executed it. And it's been a great triumph that we've been able to arrest so much of the violence. So the challenge for Obama will be, President Obama, is can we get out now, because we cannot and should not stay forever, and there should be a timetable, but do it in an honorable way so that we are able to help the Iraqis on the way out. Colin Powell said, there's the old Pottery Barn rule. You break it, you own it. That's what he said in 2003. Well, we went in and broke it and overthrew the government. And so we have a little bit of responsibility as we leave not to make the situation worse. I think this is the complexity that President Obama has to deal with. This is not easy. And so there'll be a temptation to kind of refight 2003, were we right or wrong. I think the more important question now is, how do we maintain our honor and dignity and really redeem what our soldiers have done so brilliantly and try to leave and try to help the Iraqis. And that's going to be very difficult. And what I heard from Obama in the campaign, President Obama, I was very encouraged by. So let's see what he decides to do. Thanks for the question.
More questions, Peter?
Maybe this is the right one to follow because it's about Afghanistan. We had a talk here by Tom Powers, who said, and you know his work,
Yep.
that it's impossible to win a war in Afghanistan. He spoke about the Russian failure, the British failure. There may have been others. I'm trying to remember Alexander the Great. He may be the only exception because he found his wife there.
Long time ago.
Yeah. But Tom Powers said it will
He was
destroy.
Greek, Peter.
He said he said it will destroy a president, the war in Afghanistan, and the only thing is to get out.
Well, the British were colonialists and imperialists, and the Russians were too. And I think President Obama's a smart man. And obviously, it would be a catastrophic mistake to think we could occupy for any substantial period of time, decades, Afghanistan. But no one's talking about that. But I agree with you; it's difficult. And it may be that Afghanistan becomes for President Obama what Iraq was for President Bush, the overriding preoccupation. And it seems to me that the trick will be, can we put in enough military force to fight our mortal foe, Al-Qaeda, which is there, and the Taliban, but also not become an occupier, not become an imperial power, and use some of that soft power, our economic aid, our rule of law programs at the village and tribal level, which is where Afghanistan exists as a country, and try to win some hearts and minds so that people will feel they're better off with the Afghan government than they are with the Taliban. And that's easier said than done. But that's what President Obama has said he'd like to do, and it seems to me that's probably a pretty good framework for a strategy. But if we think that somehow we can do for Afghanistan what we did for Germany and Japan, we still have troops in both places, and we have had since 1945. That won't work in Afghanistan. So it has to be something a little bit different. And I think we need to support the new president and hope he gets this right. Hope for all of us he gets it right.
Last question.
Ambassador Burns, I was wondering, since you're clearly considered one of the experts on the issues of diplomacy with Iran, whether you'd be available to President Obama if he approached you to open negotiations with them.
You'll have to ask my wife. She's sitting right here. She's happy I left the U.S. government. No, this is not about me. I've been very impressed by the people that President Obama and Secretary Clinton have hired. And there's a great team assembling in Washington. And there's some very smart people who could run those negotiations with Iran, and I wish them well. I spent 28 years in public service. I've been out for 9 months. I would love to go back at some point, but probably not this year. But I'm 100% behind President Obama, and I voted for him. But there are a lot of great people in Washington who can do that job, and we should do it. We should open up negotiations with Iran and challenge the Iranians at the negotiating table. It's interesting, when I was undersecretary, a lot of people would say, proverbial wisdom, the Iranians are great negotiators. We'll have to be very careful at the table. They may, out-negotiate us. Why is it that the United States can't be effective at diplomacy? We've got a lot of smart people in our government, a lot of smart people in this country. We can do very well with the Iranians. We can be sophisticated at the negotiating table too, so I don't fear negotiations. I don't think President Obama does either. Thank you for asking that question.
Very I agree. Nick, thanks very much.